Continuing debate, the honourable member for Barrie, Springwater or Medante.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise here again and talk about this SDTC scandal that we've been in now for a couple, maybe 3 weeks. I am here today in this House to discuss a shocking misuse of taxpayers' dollars. $400 million has been wasted while the cost of living is up, food bank usage is up, the carbon tax is up, and this Liberal government has an $8 billion budget overrun, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. As many Canadians are aware, this House has been seized with this issue for many weeks. There have been no debates on government bills and no debates on private members' bills because this issue is so important that it must take precedence over all other business, and because the Liberal government has refused to comply with a lawful order of the House of Commons. Many of my constituents at home may be wondering why I am speaking to this privileged motion for a second time. To explain, I am rising today to speak in support of an amendment to the privileged motion moved by the honourable member for Regina Capel on the failure to produce documents pertaining to the Sustainable Development Technology Canada scandal. For the benefit of other members and those watching at home, I will read the motion and the amendments. The motion states that the government's failure of fully providing documents as ordered by the House on June 10, 2024, be hereby referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The amendment from that reads, provided that it be an instruction to the committee, A, that the following witnesses be ordered to appear before the committee separately for 2 hours each. I, the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry. 2, the Clerk of the Privy Council. 3, the Auditor General of Canada. 4, the Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. 5, the Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. 6, the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel of the House of Commons. 7, the Acting President of Sustainable Development Technology Canada. 8, a panel consisting of the Board of Sustainable Development Technology Canada. And B, that a report to the House no later than November 22nd, 2024. I think that this amendment really speaks to the heart of this issue, which is ministerial accountability. I feel that it is important for the benefit of members in this place to dig deep into what ministerial accountability is and why it is so important to the issue at hand. When the member from Regina Capel raised his initial privilege motion, he referred to a document obtained from the Privy Council office. That document stated that, quote, public servants do not share in ministers' constitutional accountability to the House of Parliament, but support ministers in this accountability. It also stated that the ultimate accountability for deciding what information to withhold from or release to parliamentarians resides with the responsible minister. I agree with this. It really is the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry who is ultimately responsible for this scandal and for the violation of an order of the House. The minister must be held accountable, and that is why it is so important that he hand over these documents and appear at committee. As I mentioned, I will now discuss the origin of ministerial accountability and its relevance to today's debate at length. I think to really dig into what ministerial accountability is and what it ought to mean, we can refer to the Prime Minister's own documents, released on November 27, 2015, right when the Liberals formed government for the first time under this Prime Minister. This document or guide is titled An Open and Accountable Government, and it supposedly sets out core principles regarding the roles and responsibilities of ministers in Canada's system of responsible parliamentary government. This includes the central tenet of ministerial responsibility, both individual and collective, as well as ministers' relations with the Prime Minister and Cabinet, their portfolios, and Parliament. I think this is very fascinating. I will read from this Prime Minister's opening message to the ministers. He says, and I quote, in our system, the highest manifestation of democratic accountability is the forum of Parliament. You are accountable to Parliament for the exercise of the powers, duties and functions with which you have been entrusted. This requires you to be present in Parliament to answer honestly and accurately about your areas of responsibility, to take corrective actions as appropriate to address problems that may arise in your portfolios, to correct any inadvertent errors in answering the Parliament at the earliest opportunity, and to work with parliamentary colleagues of all political persuasion in a respectful and constructive manner. He goes on to say that this is my favourite part. You are responsible for ensuring that your departments are managed well and with complete integrity. This Prime Minister then goes on to detail that ministerial accountability means to him. He states, and I quote, "Ministers are accountable to Parliament for the exercise of the powers, duties and functions vested in them by statute or otherwise. Ministers must be present in Parliament to respond to questions on the discharge of their responsibilities, including the manner in which public monies were spent, as well as to account for that use. Whether a minister has discharged responsibilities appropriately is a matter of political judgment by Parliament. The Prime Minister has the prerogative to reaffirm support for that minister or to ask for his or her resignation. It is critical to the principle of responsible government that all organizations within the executive be the responsibility of a minister who is accountable to Parliament for the organization. A minister is accountable to Parliament for the proper functioning of his or her department and all other organizations within his or her portfolio." I rarely think or say this, but I completely agree with the Prime Minister. Ministers should be accountable to Parliament and must be present in Parliament to respond to questions on the discharge of their responsibilities, including the manner in which public monies were spent, as well as to account for that use. I will go on to discuss why this is relevant to this amendment and the issue at hand today. I would like to remind those in this place of exactly how much money was misappropriated by the board of the Sustainable Technology Development Canada Fund. When speaking to constituents, many of them draw comparisons to the sponsorship scandal. I have to remind them that the Liberal sponsorship scandal was a $40 million scandal, one that led to complete collapse of the Liberal Party because of how egregious that misuse of funds was. My constituents are baffled when I inform them that this is a $400 million scandal. $400 million of taxpayer funds, while rents are at an all-time high. Mortgage payments have doubled, and Canadians cannot even afford to feed their families. It is scandalous, and that is why Conservatives will keep pressing the government on this issue until these taxpayers' funds are repaid and the documents have been handed over. It's unfortunate that hundreds of millions of wasted taxpayer dollars means nothing to this Liberal government. We saw the indifference that they displayed when it was revealed that $56 million was wasted on the ArriveCan app, an application that did not work. Conservatives had hoped that the Liberal government had learned its lesson when that scandal occurred. Yet, here we are again, embroiled in another costly scandal. What got us to this point was the Auditor General's conclusion that SDTC board members and officials broke conflict of interest laws 186 times and funneled $400 million of taxpayers' money to their own companies. This unprecedented waste of taxpayer dollars and the Minister of Industry's refusal to be held to account for this issue is shocking. The common sense Conservative amendment that we are discussing today explicitly demands that he attend committee for 2 hours and answer for this failure. I would hope that members on all sides of this House would like to see the Minister take responsibility for the scandals and failures of his department. The Prime Minister's own document, titled Open and Accountable Government, that I referred to earlier, would seem to indicate that is what he ought to do. Now, for the benefit of my constituents and all Canadians who have been very curious about this issue, I will walk members through the timeline of this particular scandal. We know that the Sustainable Development Technology Canada was a not-for-profit foundation that was established by the Government of Canada in 2001 through a special act of Parliament, the Canada Foundation for Sustainable Development Technology Act. SDTC was created to support and finance clean technology startups with the goal of delivering economic, environmental, and health benefits to Canada. By all accounts, this fund ran well and had zero issues for 17 years. That is, until Navdeep Bains, the former Liberal Industry Minister, decimated the fund and brought in an era of corruption. In late 2018, the former Liberal Industry Minister Navdeep Bains expressed concerns regarding the chair of SDTC, Jim Basili, given his public criticism of the Liberal government's privacy legislation. Jim Basili is a widely respected Canadian businessman who is the former chair and CEO of BlackBerry. He was appointed in 2013 during the Harper government for a term of 5 years. However, in 2018, the Liberal Minister of Industry, Navdeep Bains' office expressed discomfort about Basili's comments with the CEO of SDTC and requested that the chair stop criticizing government legislation. Then, Minister Bains proposed 2 alternative chairs to the CEO of SDTC as replacements in a phone call. One of the candidates proposed is Annette Verschuren, an entrepreneur who is already receiving SDTC funding through one of her companies. This minister, PMO, and PCO were warned of the risk associated with appointing a conflicted chair and are told that up until this point the fund has never had a chair with interest in companies receiving funding from SDTC. In June 2019, Minister Baines decided to proceed with the appointment of Annette Verschuren despite repeated warnings expressed to his office. The new chair goes on to create an environment where conflict of interest are tolerated and, quote, managed by board members. Board members went on to award SDTC funding to companies in which board members hold stock or position within the company receiving funding. Minister Baines went on to appoint 2 other controversial board members who engaged in unethical behavior and breached the Conflict of Interest Act by approving funding to companies in which they hold ownership stakes. During this time, ISED officials sat in on the board meetings and witnessed 186 conflicts at the board, but did not intervene. That brings us to January 2021. The member from St. Maurice Champlain becomes the new Minister of Industry, replacing Navdeep Baines after he decided to not run for re-election. In November 2022, whistleblowers raised internal concerns with the Auditor General about unethical practices at SDTC. The Privy Council is briefed by the whistleblowers about the allegations shortly after and commissions 2 independent reports. In September 2023, the whistleblowers took the allegations public, and the Minister of Industry agreed to suspend SDTC funding. Finally, in June 2024, the Auditor General report is released, finding severe governance failure at SDTC. The Auditor General found that there were 186 times there was conflict of interest occurred, meaning the Board of Directors and the Chair handpicked where funding was going. Some of that funding went to their own companies. The Auditor General took only a sampling of the funding and found that 82% of that sampling were in a conflict of interest, totaling $330 million. The Auditor General also found that SDTC did not follow conflict of interest policies in 90 cases, spent nearly $76 million on projects connected to the Liberals' friends appointed to run the fund, spent $59 million on projects that were not allowed to have been awarded any money, and spent $12 million on projects that were both a conflict of interest and ineligible for funding. In one instance, the handpicked chair of the fund gave a shocking $217,000 to her own company. In response to these damning findings, in June, Conservatives put forward a motion calling on the government to provide to the House documents pertaining to SDTC. It included provisions for the documents to then be provided to the RCMP so that it could undertake a criminal investigation on whether criminal offences were committed. The Liberal government has refused to hand over these documents, and that is why we are still here discussing this motion today. I would now like to share some of the testimony that the SDTC whistleblower gave at committee. I find this testimony to be astounding, and I commend this individual for their bravery. The whistleblower stated, quote, "I think the Auditor General's investigation was more of a cursory review. I don't think the goal and mandate of the Attorney General's office is to actually look into criminality. I'm not surprised by the fact that they haven't found anything criminal because they're not looking at intent. If their investigation was forced on intent, of course, they would find the criminality." End of quote. He also went on to say, "I know the federal government, like the minister, has continued saying that there was no criminal intent and nothing was found, but I think the committee would agree that they're not to be trusted on this situation. I would happily agree to whatever the findings are by the RCMP, but I would say that I wouldn't trust and there isn't any criminality unless the RCMP is given full authority to investigate." Another quote I find astounding is as follows, "The true failure of the situation stands at the feet of our current government, whose decision to protect wrongdoers and cover up their findings over the last 12 months is a serious indictment of how our democratic system and institutions are being corrupted by political interference. It should never have taken 2 years for the issue to reach this point, and what should have been a straightforward process turned into a bureaucratic nightmare that allowed SDTC to continue wasting millions of dollars and abusing countless employees over the last years." And finally, and this is a quote that really gets to the root of the issue, I think that the current government is more interested in protecting themselves and protecting the situation being a public nightmare, and they would rather protect wrongdoers and financial mismanagement than have to deal with a situation like this SDTC and the public sphere. It is because of brave whistleblowers like this individual that the public was able to see the corruption and rot that the Liberal government allowed to fester at SDTC. Conservatives commend this individual and thank him for standing up for Canadians. As I just mentioned, this brave whistleblower believes that criminal intent will be found if the documents that Conservatives are requested are handed over to the RCMP. That is why it is so important that the Liberal government comply with the House order and release the documents. In closing, we are still here today discussing this issue after a month because the government refuses to comply with an order of the House. We are calling on the government to comply with the House's order and hand over the documents unredacted. Then we can find out what really went on, whether there was any criminality, which former employees at SDTC believe there to be. I will end by saying that after 9 years of this Liberal government, there has never been a better time to be a Liberal insider. Under this Liberal government, Liberal insiders feel that it is perfectly acceptable to waste $400 million of taxpayer funds while Canadians are struggling. This is a slap in the face to the people in my riding of Barrie, Springwater, or Medonte, who are struggling to make ends meet under this costly NDP Liberal coalition. Just this week, Karen Hsu, the Executive Director of the Barrie Food Bank, stated that the food bank is now supporting upwards of 7,000 people per month, 37% of which are children. Ms. Hsu went on to say that, quote, "As demand continues to rise, we face increasing challenges in keeping up, often needing to make difficult choices about which foods to cut in order to stretch our donations further." Canadians in my community are visiting food banks in record numbers because this Liberal government's inflationary taxes and spending is driving up the cost of everything. And instead of providing Canadians with the relief they deserve, the Liberal government plans to hike the carbon tax again. This costly carbon tax is not only affecting families, but also farmers in my community. I was recently sent an Enbridge bill for almost $10,000 from a farmer in my riding who runs a poultry operation. Their bill shows a carbon tax charge of $2,700 on their cost of fuel to dry grain corn. Shockingly, the carbon tax is actually more than the value of the gas before delivery and global adjustments. Moving on to the poultry side of their operation, this farm pays a comparable tax on the cost to heat their barns. Every 24 weeks, they place over 3,000 day-old breeder chicks in their barns. These barns need to be heated to 32 degrees Celsius, and the chicks are so small they cannot heat themselves. This temperature is slowly reduced as the chicks grow stronger. The cost to heat the barns during this placement is approximately $7,000, with approximately a third of that cost being the carbon tax. During this affordability crisis, one would think that the Liberals would think twice about allowing Liberal insiders to funnel $400 million to their buddies. Unfortunately, they see no issue with this corruption. I've heard from countless businesses in my riding that have suffered due to inflation, labour shortages, supply chain issues, increasing business debt, and federal tax increases. It is devastating to see these businesses, who bring joy to so many members of my community, suffer under this Liberal government's punitive policies. But Canadians have something to look forward to. They can look forward to voting for a common-sense Conservative government as the costly NDP stops propping up their government partners and calls a carbon tax election. In this carbon tax election, Canadians will have the opportunity to vote for Conservatives who will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, to bring down inflation and interest rates to make affordable again for our seniors and all Canadians. To those watching at home, I say that help is on the way. Once we have a carbon tax election, a common-sense Conservative government will axe the tax on everything, for everyone, everywhere, to bring home powerful paychecks and lower prices for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well said.